Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Connecticut Braver Angels and our partners, Connecticut Public and the Governor M. Jody Rell Center for Public Service at the University of Hartford, I welcome you. My name is Chris Clouet, and I serve as the co-chair for the state organization of Braver Angels in Connecticut. Tonight, Moving Beyond Polarization, Making Politics Work is a project of the Braver Politics branch of our organization. This is not a debate. Rather, it is a conversation guided by Bill Doherty, a founder of Braver Angels. A Q&A will follow their discussion. State Representative Cristin McCarthy Vahey, Democrat, and State Representative Stephen Harding, Republican, will discuss ideas and opportunities for making politics work in our state. Representative McCarthy Vahey sits on legislative committees, including Planning and Development and Transportation. Representative Harding is on the legislative committees, including Judiciary and Education. Thank you both for being here. Our moderator, Bill Doherty, is a professor of family and social science at the University of Minnesota. He's a practicing therapist and a national figure who has worked with the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus in the US Congress and has conducted countless workshops and discussions with elected officials and community leaders across the country. It is a pleasure to welcome Bill and our two state representatives. Again, thank you all for being here. Bill?
All right. Okay. Hello. Welcome to our conversation, Representative Harding and Representative McCarthy Vahey. Just before we came on, we were talking about the children and who might be invading the spaces because you're both at home. So just tell us about your children and whether you're safe from invasion during our time here. Maybe we could start that way. So, Representative Harding, how safe are we here?
I am about 10 miles away, so I'm in my office.
Okay.
My law office. So I tried in these meetings, particularly at night as they're nearing bedtime, to try to step away if I can. So. And
you have a 2-year-old at home who?
I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old.
Okay.
My 4-year-old's pretty good. You give him a snack and his a TV show, and he's not going to bother you. But my 2-year-old's very susceptible to walking on Dad. That's okay.
Okay.
Everyone's usually happy to see her.
Right. And then Representative McCarthy Vahey, you have a teenager who, they don't really want to, probably doesn't want to be around you, but I know you have animals that could be a threat here too, right?
Yeah, no, I think mostly my teenagers try to avoid being on camera at all costs. And the most we might hear is a baseball bat or a clink of the bat and the ball.
Great. So I want to start then by asking each of you to say why you accepted the invitation to be part of a conversation about polarization, about what we can do about it. So that's what we're here to talk about. So just a minute or so about why you accepted the invitation. So Representative McCarthy Vahey, could you start?
Well, Bill, first of all, thank you and to the Braver Angels team for having all of us here together, and Rep Harding for being together with you and everyone who's joined us today. I'm here because I think this is a really important conversation. I was asked to participate after learning about the organization, and it sounds like something that is in line with who I am and kind of how I lived my life as a previous youth minister and then social worker. We need these conversations, and I think you'll hear me saying this a few times tonight. We're all humans first. We're humans, we're family members, we're friends and neighbors, and I think during campaign season, it's a great opportunity to remember that.
Okay, thank you. Representative Harding, why did you accept the invitation?
I've had the fortunate opportunity to have one of my favorite constituents, Al Smith, who I'm sure is here this evening, give me some insight into the organization, something that he's very passionate about, and something that I'm very passionate about. And once I heard of this opportunity, I really was honored, particularly to be with Rep. McCarthy Vahey as well. And like Rep. McCarthy Vahey said, if you look at the times in our nation, when we were doing our best, that we all felt collectively, Republicans, Democrats, felt the nation was in the best direction. There was camaraderie. Was when we were working together, when there wasn't so much polarization, when Republican and Democrat didn't mean as much as being American did, or being nutmeggers here in Connecticut does. So it really is so important for the betterment of not only our state but our nation, that if we look at each other in a positive light, regardless of our political affiliation, we're going to get a lot more done. We're going to listen a lot more, which is something that our country and not only in Connecticut, but our country desperately needs right now on both sides of the aisle. So I'm really looking forward to events like this and organizations like this. I'm honored to be a part of this because it is so vitally important, I think, to the health of our government. And if you see the light go off, I'm trying to be environmentally conscious. I have these lights that go out, and I've constructively put my computer in front of the sensor. So every once in a blue moon, I have to wave my hand. So that's what's going on. If you see that happen.
Okay, so we're going to begin with a question that we've been asking elected officials in different parts of the country. It's something that often doesn't get asked. We usually start with, well, what do you think about that policy, right? And we start right there. This is a question about you as people and what led you to where you are now. So the question is, what life experiences have influenced your values and beliefs about public policy and public service? What life experiences have influenced your values and beliefs about public policy and public service? And the format is you each have up to 5 minutes to tell us about how you'd respond to that question. And then we'll kind of process that afterwards. Values and experiences influence your, life experiences that influence your values and beliefs about public policy and public service. Who'd like to start?
I could try to take a stab at that. I think multiple things, that there's not one particular moment or one particular experience in life that I think would, dictate why I believe what I believe and when I believed it, and what necessarily drove me into what I'm fortunate to be able to do today in public service. But my parents, obviously, like many of us, have or continue to be great role models to me. And my dad, in my hometown of Brookfield, which is also the great hometown of the great Governor Rell as well, and so ran baseball for many years and continues to do it. And I used to always kind of wonder why. When I was able to see as I got older why he didn't, because if he didn't, some people might not step up, and there might not be an ability for a lot of young men and women to play baseball and softball in town. And it's something, it seems simple, but in the bigger scheme of things, it means a lot, because that baseball team and any child being a part of that baseball team, and Cristin just mentioned it with her son, it can impact a life. And I think I know my father growing up knew that, and that's the reason why he did what he did. And I think that inspired me to have a focus on community, to think outside of what's beneficial maybe just to you, and what's beneficial to the entire community that you live in. And so that's one of the reasons why I've been driven towards public service, and doing what I do today. That's one aspect of it. I think that some of the policy driven aspects of what I believe, or the pride in public service, and the pride in government, and the pride in this country and this nation. Being a 14-year-old freshman when 9/11 occurred, that's obviously a life-changing moment, particularly when you're in your youth and you're becoming an adult, and seeing that terrible event, and then seeing the nation come together, and being proud to be an American again, like I talked about at the beginning. having a belief that, we were Americans before anything else, before any particular party or fanhood of a sports team. We were Americans first and foremost. And events like that and seeing, again, our nation rebuild after that terrible event certainly shaped a lot of what I believe in today. So I would kind of point to that. Again, I wish I had a specific moment that I could point to and a great story. I really don't. But I think it's a culmination of a lot of things in my life that have led me to believe what I believe and to be doing what I do today.
Okay, thank you. So Representative McCarthy Vahey.
Thank you, Bill. So I'm the oldest of 6 kids, and my dad is a Vietnam vet. He was there when I was born. And I may talk a little more about him because we lost him this summer due to Agent Orange exposure. Because of his service in Vietnam. He was a swift boat commander. And my dad was someone who literally went into the firefight. He has a Bronze Star with a V for Valor and a Navy Commendation Medal with a V for Valor and a Purple Heart, and he never talked about it. He did not pat himself on the back. And certainly as a Vietnam veteran, we left them behind in many ways. That experience and the example, like Steve said, or Representative Harding, my parents and my grandparents taught me so much. When I was going through some things in my father's, I found a letter to the editor that my grandfather had written about a highway project. And I laugh because I serve on the transportation committee, and I just yesterday had a conversation with our COG director about a highway project. A roadway project. But my grandparents on my mom's side, my grandmom started the senior center in town. My grandpa was on the Water Pollution Control Authority, which I got to serve on locally for many years. And they, just like Steve said, it was up to us to be the good citizens and to take care of each other and the community. It wasn't that we were supposed to leave it for other people to do. It was our job. And I think the other, really big piece of my life is I grew up Catholic, going to Catholic school all the way through, elementary, the parish high school, Catholic high school, and then even college. And faith was a big part of my life. We don't talk about that a lot in our service. And I believe very strongly in that separation of church and state, but my faith informs a lot of the work that I do. The sense and being taught as a child, that the point of life is to love and to serve. And it may sound corny, but it's what I believe. I believe, I wear this on my neck. This idea, the small circle connected to the larger one connection is something people hear me talk about all the time, that we are all so deeply connected to one another, and we're responsible to each other and for each other. And I really, really my family, that's where it started, my family and my community. And then being, serving as a youth minister for 6 years full time, and then as a social worker in child welfare, being able to see what that meant in terms of living that out. And now I view what we all have the privilege, the tremendous privilege and responsibility of doing as very much public service, that it's our role to serve the public. That doesn't mean we agree with everyone, and it doesn't mean we can do what everyone wants us to do all the time, but our role is to serve.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. And so as you listen to each other, what did you learn about each other that maybe you didn't know before? What stood out to you? And did you see anything in common as you told your story? So just barge in at this point, just go for it.
Yeah, well, I think that, Representative McCarthy Vahey, I think I didn't know that when you had mentioned it, I had forgotten it, but I think you had mentioned before, I'd heard you say before that your dad was in Vietnam and that you were born. It's something that when you said that, I said, oh yeah, I think I've heard that. And I did not know the extent of your father's heroism in Vietnam, though. That is something that I'm certainly very impressed by, and thank your father for your bravery to serving this country at a very difficult time, as you mentioned. And we have discussed briefly, you know, our faith. I'm Catholic, was raised Irish Catholic as well. And Irish Catholic guilt is real. I think we've discussed that as well. And I think we both grew up with a little bit of that. And we have discussed that. We have discussed that a little bit before. No, but that's your father's heroism is something that I did not know the extent of, you know, his medals and honors in Vietnam when he was there. And I'm sorry to hear I did not know that he had passed this past summer, and I did not know that. And obviously, it meant a lot to you, and you could tell you loved him very much. And I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm not surprised that, you know, Representative McCarthy Vahey is someone who's very much dedicated to public service, and hearing that background in her family is something that is certainly understandable, and I can see where the correlation is there.
Mhm.
Well, and Rep. Harding, I loved when you talked about baseball. My grandfather, my dad's dad, actually brought the first Little League field into town, the town where they were. And I was thinking about that, the role of sports and
That's
how
awesome.
important that is, access to sports for kids. And I loved what you said about that some kids wouldn't have the opportunity. And, you know, that whole idea of those of us who can do those things and take on those leadership roles to provide that opportunity and empower other people to do the same.
Absolutely.
That was certainly a theme I heard, that you both came from families that stepped up, you know, just do it. And I'm guessing did that by modeling more than by lecturing you about community service, right? I imagine, I'm just guessing that a lot of
yeah, no, Bill, you're exactly right. And it's something that, you know, it's not like I don't think my parents ever sat me down and said, this is what we do, and this is how you're supposed to. It was truly leading by example, and doing it and seeing it, and knowing the importance of it, particularly as you get older. You know, obviously as you're younger, you don't understand everything, you don't correlate everything, and then all of a sudden when a light hits and you're like, wow, my parents are a lot wiser than I thought they were. I would say that in my 20s I came to that realization, far too late in life. Well, but eventually you start looking at it and you realize what they did and what they were trying to show you, without telling you or lecturing it to you. So you know, that's something that I try to do with my young kids now, and I'm sure that's something Rep. McCarthy Vahey does, you know, with her family, and is leading by example. And I have a long way to go and big shoes to follow.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Rep. Harding. And in terms of, you know, in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, I feel like every year I continue to have more respect and understanding for the sacrifices and example that my parents gave, and also community members. I mean, that's the other thing I would say, teachers and coaches who were there, and, you know, event leaders and volunteers who gave us opportunities, because like I said, I was the oldest of 6. My youngest was 15 years younger than me. So my parents had their hands full, and there were other adults in my life who really made an impact. And I'm sure if you, with the sports piece, you have the same thing. Those coaches, they end up being a big part of your life.
Yeah. Well, and as we transition to talking about polarization, I'm wondering if elected officials knew more about each other's stories, if that might help. I'm just reflecting on that, as we have 2 people from different parties here. You knew something about each other, but it's in more depth now. Do you think that would help if people knew each other's stories? Representative Harding?
Yeah, undoubtedly, yes. Yeah, I think that it helps to humanize each side. I think that instead of looking at somebody as a political opponent necessarily, you look at them as a fellow colleague, and you understand each other's perspectives. You know, when you hear someone say, I believe this, and you say to yourself, well, how could you possibly believe this? Doesn't it defy logic what you may believe? And when you get to see a person's background and hear from them on where they come to the position they come to, and understand their background and who they are. You gain a much better perspective, understanding, oh, well, I can see why you think of it this way. And I think that's where I think it would help the most in terms of our polarization, in terms of wrapping our minds on both parties around particular ideas and legislation is, as you mentioned, understanding each other's background, because I think it gives us a much better ability to understand why our particular colleagues on either side of the aisle might look at something differently than you do.
Mhm.
Bill, I couldn't agree with Rep. Harding more. My father, who, as I said, I may talk about him more, so forgive me. I loved him very much, and we fought like cats and dogs about politics.
Okay.
We were on completely different sides of many issues, but because we had a relationship with each other and we loved and respected each other, you know, we could do it. Sometimes we couldn't do it, and we didn't, right? So I think that, to answer your question, relationships really are the basis of so much of what we do in life, and we talk about it all the time in the legislature. So the ability to connect on that human level then allows us to have those more difficult conversations. And in fact, you know, Rep. Harding and I, we may fight about some issues, you know, we may, and we can completely disagree on those issues. But I think when you have relationships with folks, then you are able to have those discussions and disagreements without having them be really disagreeable or less focused on the issues, right? And focus more on the person. In other words, to the idea of focusing more on the issues themselves and having that real debate, rather than, you know, getting into those assigning motives to people and intent to people that are assumed.
Well, okay, so we made the transition to talking about polarization here. So what are your thoughts? I mean, in Connecticut and broadly, what's led to this these high levels of polarization? You know, the one thing that Americans agree on is that we're too divided. That we, over 90% of the people in the polls agree that we're too divided. So that's a start. We agree. So what's going on? What's led to this historic polarization?
I guess I can start. I mean, I think it's a culmination of a lot of things. I don't think you could point to one particular incident or event or one particular issue and say that's the reason why the country has become so polarized. I think that, you know, one thing is the parties. I look back, you know, it's interesting because I've you know, leading up to this event, and even in prior to this event, I would often think about this. But the parties, the Republican and Democrat, wasn't a set ideology. If you date back maybe 40, 50 years ago, you had Republicans that were as liberal as any Democrat today, and you had Democrats that were more as conservative as any Republican today. So there wasn't so much identity surrounding party as it was identity surrounding maybe where you represented or who you represented or what you believed in or whatever your political philosophy may have been. It wasn't, nowadays the parties have become such a standard of this is what you're supposed to believe if you're in this particular party, and this is what you're supposed to believe if you're in that particular party, that you didn't see maybe, as I said, only 30, 40 years ago. You look at like, you know, Jacob Javits in the Republican Party or Rockefeller in the Republican Party. You know, they certainly had a more liberal philosophy, but were still Republicans. And so that's what I kind of think that's part of it, is that the party has become such a solid identity on what you're supposed to believe and subscribe to, that I think that has probably led to a lot of the polarization. You know, again, that's just one idea. I don't think that's the one reason, but I think it's one reason in maybe many reasons and events that has led to the polarization we have today.
Okay, so Representative McCarthy, there's a lot of factors here, but you know, go for it.
So there are a lot of factors. I think polarization exists within parties and between parties. So it's happening, both inter and intra. I do think that social media and the change in the model of media delivery has made a very significant impact. I think that most of us policymakers and most Americans do not understand algorithms, and I'm one of them. I would say I have a basic level of understanding, but I'll speak to knocking on doors the other day, talking to a woman who said, I have no idea how you can be a Democrat. And then going down the street, literally, and hearing from a woman who said, I have no idea how people can be Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
My husband still is still registered as a Republican, though he, is probably a little bit more of an unaffiliated by definition. But I think that part of it is we don't want to listen because, frankly, being uncomfortable in having your beliefs challenged is something that a lot of us don't want to do. And in fact, when, Rep. Harding, you're talking about identity, I talked earlier about going to Catholic grade school. We identified by our parish community as a child. Oh, I'm from St. Philip and James. You go to St. Joe's. You go to St. Simon and Jude. And I grew up in a time when I was, part of what I was taught, besides the to love and to serve as a Catholic, it was the one true faith, right? The idea of better. I think polarization in part happens, whether it's related to religion, identity, or politics, is the idea that we see ourselves as better. And I think that, obviously, when we're trying to pass bills, we're trying to get to 50% plus one, right? We want the majority of people to side with us so that we can pass the legislation that we think is the best legislation. How do we pass policies and pass bills and, create a path forward for our government without necessarily looking at ourselves as some kind of more superior human being? I think that's a really big part of this. And I think the other is sometimes just the lack of connection. Certainly the last couple of years has been extremely difficult. I found over my many years of being involved that people have very different conversations when we're sitting face to face with one another and having a direct exchange than when we exchange, comments on social media, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of those things have contributed tremendously to polarization, again, both inter and intra-party.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Representative Harding, does that disconnection make sense to you? I saw you nodding there.
Yeah, no, it is. I think Rep. McCarthy Vahey is spot on, and I think it brought up another idea to me. And what she had said is social media and the technology that we have today, I think certainly is playing a role. And the constant cable news media, I think, plays a very strong role. I had one grandmother passed away a couple of years ago, but I had two grandmothers. One is still with us, and she is as conservative as they come. My other grandmother was very liberal, and they would drive up from the city to see us, and I think would argue the entire way up. And fortunately, they ended up in one, all with all their pieces together when they came out of the car. But my aunt, when she visits from Florida to see my grandmother, will not allow her to watch Fox News and says you cannot turn this on. And I think that the reason being is because it's this constant news cycle on both sides that you're watching all day long that has absolutely a particular political bend to it, depending on what you're watching. And it's constant. You never get a break from it if you want to tune into it. I think if you date back, prior to that, people had other things going on in their lives during the day. It wasn't always on. It wasn't always talking about politics. You got to watch a comedy show for a little to break it up. And so I think that's part of it too, is and I think Rep. McCarthy Vahey mentioned it with social media. Between social media and the cable news networks, the 24-hour news networks, if you want to tap into politics literally all day long, you can. And I don't think that's necessarily healthy. I think having a break and going about your day without politics in your mind is probably not a bad thing. I think that, getting enveloped in it on a literally a 24/7 basis, I think does create a problem, and I think does lead to this type of polarization. Because if you're hearing one side talk over and over and over again and saying the same thing, you're just going to subscribe to that theory, and no one's going to be able to talk you out of it. And that's what polarization is. That kind of, I was nodding along because that's what I was thinking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When Representative McCarthy, when you talked about the Vietnam War, I'm old enough to remember Walter Cronkite was the CBS anchor during that time. And two things I'll just share. One is he would, at the end of it, he would say, and that's the way it is, December 1st. And that was what we thought it was. We didn't, it wasn't, there weren't 18 different shows. And then the other thing I remember is that when they went from 15 minutes of national news to a half an hour, a lot of us wondered how they would fill the half hour. Okay, so now you're talking about 24/7. Yeah.
Right, and Bill, just to add, and that's the way it is from how he saw it, right, and how his network was presenting it. And the reality is there is no fully unbiased anything or anyone. And part of it is recognizing and learning to recognize our own bias and and where we came from. That's why I love that you start with, where are the things that you come from. But also, again, Rep. Harding, it's the cable news piece, but social media is where most people get their news these days. And those are algorithms that are being designed by, coders who work for those companies. And people are seeing different things in those where they think, it's just showing up in their feeds. It's not just showing up. To your point, Rep. Harding, if I choose to turn on one of the national news, cable news networks, then yes, I will see something. And I think, again, this, to me, it goes back to, how are we educating our children? I remember the nuns teaching us to analyze advertisements, as even as young as 4th and 5th grade, to understand, what's being presented so that we can ask critical questions. And again, to be comfortable with the discomfort of disagreement, to be comfortable enough with ourselves to be open to other ideas.
You both talked about family members who are comfortable with the discomfort, right? And so, yeah.
I don't know how comfortable were they, but they were forced to be comfortable.
Well, they good
but
point.
To your point, they were able to
were able to that's
have a discussion, have a disagreement, and then walk out of the car and enjoy their day with their family,
right,
without holding it against each other the rest of the day.
That's
and
right.
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of folks that can do that anymore. So I think they also came from a different generation where that was understood and accepted, that you could have a political disagreement and walk away still friends, and walk away still being respectful of each other. And I think that, we're now in generations now where that's getting harder and harder to do. And that's part of the issue that we're facing and talking about tonight.
So let's talk, we're talking about so far themes that are really national themes. So how do you think that this polarization is showing up in Connecticut? How do you see it in your world?
Well, you want me to start with this one, Rep. Harding?
By all means, yeah.
I think that there's definitely been a trickle down in the national conversations, from the national conversations. And we're seeing that, it's after Labor Day, so the campaign season is heating up. And the type of rhetoric that we're hearing is always a little bit more intense during campaign season. But I would say that it feels different for me than it has in the years past that I've been running for office. Things have sharper edges, and frankly, we've seen an increase in the number of hate crimes. We've seen an increase in, obviously, political violence. January 6th is something that I never would have dreamed ever seeing or experiencing in my lifetime. We've seen a level of acceptance. And again, this has happened actually, like I said, intra-party. I was reading about a primary, a Democratic primary in another state, and the kind of rhetoric that was used within that primary. And it certainly happens across parties. Violence of language. And I talk often privately about my experience of going to the Holocaust Museum in DC. When we dehumanize other people, it starts with language. It starts with words. It starts with the things we say about one another. And I'm a social worker. So the things we say, they begin to impact how we think about people. And then it begins to impact how we behave. And, you know, we're seeing that here. Again, you know, that conversation, which was very friendly, that I had at both of those stores when I talked about the person saying, I just can't even imagine how you can be a Democrat. And she wanted to walk away, but I asked, you know, tell me more.
Okay.
But that's just, again, the sense of when we use words that describe each other in language that is, and I don't think, I honestly don't think that a ton of this is happening in Connecticut. But when we start to get to those more dehumanizing words and phrases, that's really problematic.
Mm-hmm. Representative Harden?
Yes, I mean, you know, Rep. McCarthy Vahey discussed it, that, yeah, obviously, Connecticut is not different than the other 49 states in the country. And as we're going to have, if the country is trending towards more polarization, generally Connecticut is going to do the same. I would like to think, and I think Rep. McCarthy Vahey would probably agree with me, that I think in our state government, you know, when we're together in the legislature outside the campaign season, I think you mentioned it, Rep. McCarthy Vahey, I think unfortunately things do tend to change drastically once Labor Day hits up until November 8th. Things become more polarizing. Everything seems to become political. People seem to take their sides and don't want to listen to the other. And so it becomes more polarizing. And you do see that in Connecticut, unfortunately, as you see it in the rest of the country. You know, I will speak in regards to what I can speak to related to the legislature as I wave my hand. There we go. And I think Rep. McCarthy Vahey can speak to this as well, that I don't, even though it absolutely gets political because it's a political building, and there have been times where we have been polarized to some extent or the other, you do see kind of a professionalism and a respect for the most part in the legislature amongst colleagues. And I think more so than folks would probably think if they just focus during the campaign season in regards to the state reps and state senators. When you join the legislative body and you get to know your colleagues, and I think that's part of what Rep. McCarthy Vahey mentioned, is getting to know who you're working with, and you spend a lot of hours in that gold dome, and you're forced to get to know each other on both sides of the aisle, whether it be through committee work or discussions on particular bills that are passionate to us and others, or whether it be just sitting in the chamber at 2:00 in the morning, having another bill come out and turning to whoever's next to you, Republican or Democrat, and saying, you know, how you doing? How you getting through session? It allows you an ability to look at the person, as I said, other than just a Republican or Democrat, but as a fellow colleague and a mother or a father, a brother or a sister, or a son or a daughter. And it allows us to have to break away from the polarization, as we've mentioned. So yeah, I think we're seeing it here in the state, particularly as we hit the campaign season, as much as we probably see it in other states, unfortunately. But when it comes down to doing the work in the Capitol building in Hartford, it seems to be much more respectful and professional that I've seen than you would think if you stepped outside the building.
Bill, may I jump in? I agree. I think there is a lot of collegial work together. I think there's a lot of bipartisanship. I mean, I can tell you on our committee in planning and development, I spend a lot of time with the House ranking member, and I know Rep. Harding and Rep. Gresko spend a lot of time talking with each other as well. But sometimes when we get to those really the issues that people get really passionate about. And that happens when we are debating the budget, for example, or when we're debating, these days, some of our election laws. And we've had some tricky ones over the past couple of years when we've talked about the COVID emergency powers. Things have gotten very personal for people and very passionate. And sometimes that personal and passionate has bled into, some real anger, and sometimes, maybe not quite as respectful and professional. And again, the frustration that people feel and dealing with that frustration, I think being not in person made that a lot harder, because when you step out of the chamber together and have a conversation, you do sometimes see people having heated conversations, but that's not as common. And I think one of the other things that's really been difficult in terms of polarization, and I'll speak to this, for myself, is when there's, and this, I know people feel this on both sides of the aisle, misinformation that's being shared. I can think of a debate that occurred at one point, and sometimes when comments are being shared and you hear that, people react, and people really struggle with that. There's no fact checker on the floor, and I'm not going to say that that's just one party or the other. Sometimes people stick a little more closely to very defined facts than others in their remarks, but I think that's really raised a lot of fire for people, especially again in some of those more sensitive or loaded topics. And we've had our fair share of them, I think, haven't we, Rep. Harding, over the past couple of years?
And if I may, Bill, Rep. McCarthy Vahey, brings up a good point, and it's something that I failed to mention, and that is, there have been more heated debates. I've been doing this. I think, were we both elected in the 2014 election cycle? I think, yeah. So I was elected in a special election in February of 2015, but I consider myself a 2014 freshman. Probably not. I'm probably not. I don't know what the exact rules are, but that's what
we'll figure that out. Okay.
So I would say that things have changed in terms of the one thing I could say in the Capitol that has changed, despite the fact that for the most part we have a collegial relationship and work together fairly well, as Rep. McCarthy Vahey mentioned. There have been more heated debates than I think that I've seen when I first entered the building, and I think Rep. McCarthy Vahey would probably agree that it didn't seem as personal sometimes, and it's rare. It's not every bill. It's actually not 95 or even probably as much as 98 or 99% of bills, but that 1 or 2% of bills that have come out where we've seated that kind of personal, heated exchange that you would think you'd see in Washington, D.C. and one of the cable media networks. I think that I had never seen that in 2015 or 2016 as much, and then I would say, particularly the last 2 years, you've seen a lot of that. And I think, unfortunately, I think part of it I think has to do with not being in person as much. I think we're moving more and more back to being in person, and there's a lot of, tonight is a great example of the efficiency and the effectiveness of Zoom. We wouldn't be able to have this and have probably as many participants if we were live at some site or location. So there's absolute benefits to it, and we've moved to Zoom committee meetings and Zoom public hearings, and there's absolutely significant benefits to it. But I think one of the side effects that are not positive, the negative side effects, I think is a slight polarization. I think that there's a lot to be said for standing outside the hall of the House and having a private one-to-one discussion on an aspect of the bill that you may agree or disagree with, and then going into the chamber and having a discussion, as opposed to trying to do it via Zoom or over the phone. It's just not the same, and I think most of us would agree with that. So I think not being with each other in person as much and having personal face-to-face discussions, I think have played a role in that over the past couple of years.
This is really interesting. Most of us who are not elected officials don't have access to this kind of conversation you're having now about the increase in these kind of polarized speeches, and also just the subtleties of Zoom versus face-to-face. I wanted to, though, ask, you both referred to heated and passionate. What's the toxic part of that? In other words, I'm sure, I know people could be heated, people could be passionate. Is there something there beyond heat and passion that seems destructive?
Yeah, I would, one thing is, when you start personal or even indirect personal attacks, I think that's an aspect of that. You start questioning a person's integrity and honesty. There's a certain level of decorum that you quickly learn when you're in the chamber that you have to follow. And the rules in some respects can seem archaic, but in other respects, when looking at it at a 35,000 foot perspective, they make a lot of sense, because it almost forces you to have a level of respect for one another, even when discussion gets heated. When you see, I think we've seen more folks kind of break that level of decorum, and I think that's probably one of the things Rep. McCarthy Vahey is alluding to, which then tends to lead to more of a personal attack on the other individual that's bringing out the bill, or an individual that's questioning the bill, that you generally would never see before, or you had not seen often before. That's kind of how I look at it. I'm sure Rep. McCarthy Vahey can shed more light on that, but that's kind of what I'm referencing.
Yeah, I absolutely, I agree with that. And that sense, I mean, there are things that get said on the floor that are sometimes incorrect. Sometimes it's a mistake. Sometimes it's the person is, just that's their belief of the facts. But again, those personal pieces. And I think the other piece of the conversations that happen on the floor is, again, I know I keep referencing social media, and my teenage children don't always appreciate these conversations either, but what we say back in the districts and at home, it used to be, if people, years ago, you had an event and you had a conversation, and things may or may not trickle back. But now, it's a different type of conversation that's happening back at home sometimes with people. And then if you come back to the Capitol, if you're saying one thing back at home with people and different audiences that you're talking to, and that kind of trickles into the conversation that you're having at the Capitol, there's not the same kind of trust. Trust is part of relationships. And I talked about relationships, and I talked about connection. And when we feel disconnected, when we do not trust one another, when we think, oh, they're saying one thing over here and another thing over there, that and obviously you don't have the same conversation with every group that you're meeting with. That's just a natural part of life. But there's more of that heated rhetoric in some of those conversations that are happening back at home. I would also say that being apart, I use this analogy. COVID was a global trauma. I'm going to say that again. COVID was a global trauma, and we are all now living with the results of that trauma. Everyone wants to choose, to assign blame to different pieces of it, and that's people's prerogative. But the fact is, whatever we think or feel about how we all moved through it, we're all still together in the same place of having to recover from that. Mm-hmm. And I use the analogy of, as legislators, it was like going through finals week. And then when you come home from college, for those of us who are privileged to go to college, then you get sick and you kind of fall apart. And, we've all collectively, in our own different ways, I think, tried to kind of hold it together as we got through that experience. And now we are having to recover, all of us. And that is true for us as a legislature as well.
Makes sense. So what are your thoughts about what can be done to reduce polarization? There's of course the national aspects of it, but Connecticut as well. What are some things we can do to reduce it?
I think there are a lot of, I think we discussed a lot of them already this evening. And I think that, the biggest thing, and I keep on hitting back on it because I think it's probably the most important thing, is getting to know one another before we take assumptions. And I think Rep. McCarthy Vahey made a really good point in the example she gave door knocking, that you hit on somebody's door and they say, I can't believe someone could be a Democrat, and then you hit the next door and it's, I can't believe someone could be a Republican. That's not that's going to lead to the polarization we don't need in this country. I think before we make an assumption about this person is wrong, I think if we can train ourselves, and I think it takes some training, and this, I think we all could do this. I could certainly be a big aspect of doing this. Would be asking ourselves, why does that person have that perspective? And sometimes it's really simple, just asking why. And I think Rep. McCarthy Vahey made a good point about one of the doors that she was at, where the person said, I can't believe someone could be a Democrat. And despite the fact that Rep. McCarthy Vahey is obviously a Democrat, instead of saying, okay, bye, she said, why do you have that perspective? You get to understand what the person is thinking and why they have the perspective that they have. And it allows us to understand how someone may see something differently. And it doesn't mean that it's going to change our opinion. I think in most cases it won't. But at least you can walk away with a level of respect saying, well, I understand why you come to that conclusion. I may have a different one because I believe X, Y, and Z, but I understand why you have that belief. And treating the other individual with a level of respect can maybe open their mind to how you see the things that you see. And maybe they take a step back and say, well, you know what, I guess I could understand how you could be a Democrat, or I guess I could understand how you could be a Republican. So I think that is a huge aspect of it, is, and I think Rep. McCarthy Vahey's made a lot of sites to it tonight. And it's also being comfortable being uncomfortable. I like that phrase. It's very easy just to walk away and say, well, I don't want to deal with this right now. I don't want to hear their perspective, because it's a lot easier just to turn my back and walk away because it might be awkward. Being okay with being awkward, hearing their position is a good thing. And I think it's something that we need to be more accepting of, is, okay, I might not be comfortable hearing your viewpoint, but I'm going to hear it anyway. I'm going to listen to it. I think it's really, I think what we're all boiling down to is listening. I think that we're doing a lot of talking and a lot of lecturing and not enough listening. And I think all the things that we're pointing to tonight involve listening more. If we could all just sit back and listen for a little bit, I think we'd go a long way in addressing the polarization. And I'd like to say there's a specific idea that I have, other than just generalities like that. But I mean, that's I think that's the biggest thing we need to cross right now in terms of polarization.
Okay, thank you. Representative McCarthy Vahey, what can we do about this?
Well, as I listened to Rep. Harding, I agree. Active listening is, in graduate school and social work, they taped us and they had us practice. It's a skill that can be learned and practiced. And to actively listen so that we understand when we're asking someone why, to reflect back that we get that what they're saying, and they can say, yes, you understand. Listening is not the same as agreeing. I think people often conflate the two. Listening and agreeing are not the same thing. But to be able, as Rep. Harding said, to listen, to build that mutual respect, to make connections with one another, to build the relationship so there is some level of trust. You can't do this work without some level of trust. The voters do not vote for us without some level of trust in us. And in a district like mine, we have new districts, but in many of those purple districts, there's a large majority of people, or a large plurality, I should say, who didn't vote for you or who don't agree with you. And you still represent them. And there's still, for me, very much a desire to listen, even though there are plenty of folks out there who would say to both Rep. Harding and I, well, I don't think you listened to me. You didn't listen to me because you didn't do what I wanted. But that's, I think, one part of it. I think another part of it is being very conscious and aware of the language that we use. I did attachment research in my graduate program. And interestingly, attachment, when we look at infants, the early researchers, they were linguists.
Mhm.
So I talked about, going to the Holocaust Museum, those first exhibits, they're language based, being very aware of the words we use, of the tone we take. And I think maybe I'm going to show my social work background again, which is taking a deep breath, taking a step back, literally being able to regulate our emotions. The Social Emotional Learning Collaborative, Mark Brackett at Yale talks about recognizing and identifying our emotions. I think that's a big part of both effective learning in the classroom for students, but also effective legislating. When we go into fight or flight mode, our brains are not able to fully use the incredible resources they have to problem solving.
Well, you both are sounding like talking about what we try to do at Braver Angels workshops, and what you guys are doing here, listening, being curious as a kind of foundation. My last question is one that the Connecticut folks who organized this were particularly interested in, and that is, are there challenging issues facing Connecticut that you think could particularly benefit from more cross-party problem solving? Are there issues pending now you really, boy, if you could work together across parties, you could make headway on? What might those be?
Every issue, frankly. I think that, if we tackled it in a more partisan measure, I firmly believe that, obviously I have more conservative viewpoints than liberal viewpoints. However, I often find that the best solution, and I'm sure McCarthy Vahey would agree, that it lies somewhere in the middle. Oftentimes, the best pieces of legislation that gets passed are ones that have been negotiated by both sides over and over and over and over again until it gets its final product where everyone agrees. I mean, I look back at the bipartisan budget in 2017, and we're still seeing the positive fruits of that budget today in 2022. And that was a budget in which, both sides, for the most part of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, joined to support a budget which had not been seen in a very long time. It was an effort by both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats in the legislature, and leadership, sitting down and working together and crafting something that worked for the state. And again, every side didn't get what they wanted. Not one side walked away from the table completely thrilled, but at the end of the day, we realized that it was the best product that we could provide for both sides, and it worked out being something that I think we're benefiting from economically and fiscally today. So I think there's a plethora of issues. I think health insurance is one thing. Tackling that as a state, that's a critical issue, and it's something that unfortunately gets polarized politically, but that's one issue that I think we should be tackling in a bipartisan fashion. And if we do, I think we can make a lot of headway in providing a better alternative and a better product for the people of the state. You're talking about, the bureaucracy in our state government, and taking a real look at that and seeing ways that we can become more efficient. That's become polarized politically in many ways. I think if we could tackle that issue, I think we can make a lot of good long-term change for the people of the state. And I think that is something that both sides are willing to tackle together. So those are two particular areas that I look at. I think that there's bipartisan support in regards to the issues and what we need to do. It's just a matter of effectively getting everybody together on both sides of the aisle to actually do it. The constructive and hard part of all that, but I think it's something that can be done. And so those are two particular areas in a plethora of many that I think that we could tackle here at the state of Connecticut in a bipartisan fashion. Make lives better for all of us in the state, which is obviously what all our goals are.
Okay, Representative McCarthy Vahey,
Well, I'll go to two that Rep. Harding and I work on in our committees. I co-chair the Coastal Caucus, and the climate is, I mean, we saw it this week, the extreme weather events. We will be forced to deal with these issues in a different way than we have, out of necessity. And that is definitely something that, you know, trying to move into those conversations. And again, to really be able to dive into those issues, that is another specific example, which is an issue that we have, both the Housing Committee and Planning and Development have been talking about, is the housing crisis in our state, which is something impacting nationally also. Both of those are issues that impact at the national level and that we have a role to play in here in Connecticut. And what we've seen in the conversation specifically around housing and around zoning have been a lot of very polarizing conversations, if not among legislators, then out in the public, and certainly will be part of the campaign. Already is as well. We had a New York Times piece that came up this week. You know, it's out there because of, especially in Fairfield County, being such an expensive market, one of the most in the nation. So how do we get at some of those issues in a way that has, again, those honest conversations about the roots and the core, and then the real possibilities and the range of solutions that we may look to address? And I think both of those things are issues that we will deal with for our lifetimes. I imagine, Rep. Harding, you will be dealing with it longer than I will. But our children and beyond will be dealing with both of those issues. So what do we do now together to help create a healthy future and a sustainable future? And I think it'll take all of the best minds working together to deal with that.
Thank you both. It just strikes me that when you say sustainable solutions that both sides contribute to, so that when the next party gains power, they don't just throw it out, right? That's some of what happens when you talk about a piece of legislation that works well. Both sides have an investment in improving it and in keeping it, as opposed to overturning it. Okay, well, so rich conversation that we'll continue with questions. And so we're going to now try the technology here that I'm going to call on somebody. And if you're willing to be popped onto the screen, there's a question. Let me take a look here. There's a question about whether members of the legislature socialize together, whether you see each other. So this is Nancy Biter, B-I-T-E-R. If you're willing to allow yourself to be pop on the screen, you can. Oh, hey, there you are. Right. No shyness at all. I was going to keep talking until you appeared, and there you came. So why don't you pose your question?
Thank you. Basically, what I'm wanting to know is, my father was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And in those days, there was a lot of socialization going on. When people got elected, they moved to Washington, dragged the whole family with them, and bought houses and settled there, hoping they'd be there for a long time. And so there was a lot of interaction. There were cocktail parties, dinner parties, and a lot of socializing. I mean, even as recently as 15 years ago, we had the Singing Senators, which were a bipartisan group of senators who were in a little chorus together. And everybody ate in the Senate dining room or the House cafeteria. And there was a lot of interaction, which really helped. And I'm not saying that they didn't have their differences, because we all know that we have had differences in this country forever. But I'm just wondering if that kind of socialization happens in our state legislatures. I'm from New Hampshire. I don't think it happens here, because they're.
So why don't you just pose the question and let them respond now?
All right.
Okay. Yeah, go for it. Who'd like to start with that one?
Yeah, so Nancy, that's a great question, and I think it's something that first off, it's the crux of it. I think what we keep on hitting on tonight, which is getting to know one another and looking at ourselves beyond our party and what we believe, our philosophies, getting to know our families, getting to understand our perspectives. It's something that I had heard before, and I actually forgot to mention tonight, was that I think that was a big aspect of the polarization in Washington, is that at one time, because of the travel and technology, many of the representatives and senators spent most of their time, a lot of their time, in DC together. So they got to know one another. We live in a world today, the benefits of it is that, you can get on a plane, particularly in our area, where you're on a plane in DC, and an hour and change later, you're sitting in, Westchester County Airport or JFK or Bradley, wherever it may be. And so it just so you don't spend as much time in DC, which there's a benefit. You see your constituents more, which is always a significant positive. But in terms of your colleagues in DC, you don't get to know them like you would have 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. But to answer your question, that was a long-winded answer, and I apologize. But there's definitely a level of socialization. I can't say there's many, dinner parties or things like that. I have young kids, so it's a little harder to get. And I know, Rep. McCarthy Vahey's kids are a little older, but nonetheless, they have a lot of events and activities. So getting them between baseball and dance or wherever you're going, it's got to be difficult to schedule time to kind of socialize with our colleagues. But I from as I've mentioned before, at least within the building, and there is a very good camaraderie from what I see on both sides of the aisle. There's a fondness and a respect for a lot of our colleagues, again, on both sides of the aisle. And I think we continue to communicate through text and what the modern day technology is, Facebook or over the phone, whatever the case may be. But we do stay in touch, and we do get to know each other, I think, fairly well.
So, McCarthy, yeah.
Thanks, Bill. I would say, Nancy, there's not as much non-policy, non-work type of socializing, certainly the past 2 years for sure. And from what I've heard prior to our time in the legislature, there was a different kind of that. Some of the campaign financing has changed some of that too, and the nature of the way that socializing happens, which is, a lot of good things for ethics rules and things like that. But this year there was a kickball game that was started, and that idea of making connection that's just social connection, not we're going to sit down and negotiate this and happen to have a conversation about how are our kids doing before we start the meeting. And I don't think we don't have a whole lot of that, because we are a part-time legislature, although the National Caucus of State Legislatures, or NCSL, calls us more of a hybrid. So we also are a small state, so people are not, in the Capitol together. And some other states, state legislators are together, staying in the state capitol for a period of days or weeks. We don't have that in Connecticut. So I think that it's really important that, things like that kickball game and some other, I'll give Speaker Ritter and some other of our colleagues credit for working together to do some of those more social, fun things to create those connections.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. So Gary George has a question about funding and partisan PACs. So Gary, if you, when you pop on the screen here. There we go. Hi, Gary. If you could unmute yourself and then pose your question, that'd be great.
Hello. Yeah, I think what's missing in some of the discussion here is money. I mean, money is a big driver by special interests who are trying to get across their own point of view and their agenda. And you have out-of-state PACs and rich people who are sending a lot of money into our state and other states to get their agendas across. And, and it's from a psychological perspective, repetition of the same message, look at advertising for any product, tends to make people believe, well, there's some validity to that, whether there is or not, because they're not really looking at it from a critical thinking aspect to Representative McCarthy Vahey's example, what you learned in school from the nuns. So I guess my question is, I mean, how do you guys as representatives deal with this flood of money? Because money buys access. And I think a lot of this came out of the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court a while back. And also, money is an issue when it comes to local television stations. And I don't know what the numbers are if most people in Connecticut get their news, political news from local TV, but it does have an impact.
So I think your question
a lot
is
of
really
how they cover things is
so if you could
related.
just wrap up your question. I think it's a good, clear question. So why don't we go to your responses? Why don't you go first this time, Representative McCarthy Vahey?
Sure. Gary, thanks for that question. There's no question whatsoever that money plays a role in politics in Connecticut with the Clean Elections Program. And thanks to everyone who put that in place, which was prior to our time. It really is a different kind of conversation. I remember a former colleague of ours, of Rep. Harding and mine, who served both before clean elections and then after, talked about the difference in some of the conversations because most of us participate in that. We raise really a small amount of money, relatively speaking. We get the state match, and then we all have to spend just that amount, and contributions are limited. So I think it's still true what you're saying, because we see different industries who are able to pay for lobbyists to come in, and certainly, lobbyists are a big part of our conversations in the legislature. We learn a lot of things from them, but they're also, they're representing clients. So money is part of it, but I think Connecticut in general has done a better job than some other states with that. And I don't know, I'm not sure if Rep. Harding would agree, but that's my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I've first off, Governor Rell played a huge role in making that possible. That was one of her initiatives in taking office, and it's one of the things that we're benefiting from as a state a number of years later. So I've always participated in this. It's the CEP program here in the state. It's a clean elections program, and basically how it operates, and Rep. McCarthy Vahey mentioned it, is that you raise a certain amount of money if you're running for the House. It's $5,000. If you're running for the Senate, I think this might be. I just raised it, so I should remember. But you raise a certain amount of money, and then once you hit that amount, and the key thing is you need a certain amount of donors from your district. So you're not generally getting money from outside your district. Primarily, you're trying to get the system is designed so that your donors are essentially your future constituents. And so you have no one to answer to, essentially, other than your constituents, which is what our job is supposed to be. So it really is an incredible program, and I think it's driven a lot of the money aspects out of politics in Connecticut, where the far majority of legislators participate in this CEP program. There's only a handful that I can think of off the top of my head that don't. And you hear some stories from reps and senators who have been around a little longer and had been running for election previous to the implementation of the clean election program. And lobbyists drove a lot of the funding for the campaigns previous to this program. So it really is. It's an incredible program, and something that's very unique here in the state of Connecticut. I think there are a few other states that do have similar programs, but not many. And I think it's part of what makes. I think it's a definite positive aspect of dividing some of the polarization and taking a lot of the money out of the politics, which is very important.
It's nice to have something encouraging here about the something to avoid polarization. So last question, Gary Holland, who is from the Connecticut Braver Angels Alliance. So he's got a good softball question for you both here. So Gary, you want to hop on? So Gary, you're on.
Yes, I'd just like to ask the representatives, if there was one thing an organization like Braver Angels could do to help you improve how politics works in the legislature, what might that be?
Go for it.
Yeah, you know, I think Rep. McCarthy Vahey mentioned it in regards to the first question we received from the audience, and that was that we really don't have a lot of events to work together or to spend time with one another outside of policy-driven discussions. And so I think the Braver Angels, if by coordinating events with legislators and just having very informal discussions about what we do and some workshops together, would be a really effective idea. And anything that we can do to foster gaining a better relationship with one another it would really be helpful. And I think that's the crux, I think, of what we've all been saying tonight in many different ways. But anything that Braver Angels can do in helping to foster the relationships between the legislators, Republican and Democrat, and I think tonight's a great example of that. But continuing to do these type of workshops, bringing the parties together and the legislators together on both sides of the aisle is something that I think will continue to foster a positive relationship and kind of break up the polarization that we're all looking to break up.
Representative McCarthy.
Thank you. And Rep. Harding, I certainly agree with that in terms of within the political leadership, that ability to connect. I also think about our broader community, and I know that's part of what Braver Angels does, is help people have conversations with one another. And a number of years back, I was part of our racial imbalance and then became our cultural diversity task force. And we helped facilitate with grant funding community conversations on diversity. And we had, targeted conversations. Again, it was grant funding that was given out to help train facilitators, bringing together stakeholders in the community to talk about issues of race, one of the more difficult topics that we have talked about even in the past 2 years. This was a number of years ago. But those kinds of conversations, we all need helpers and facilitators when we get to that place. Again, I'm a social worker, so families and couples, they come to counselors to help them listen to one another. As the Braver Angels program, I think, seeks to do, you can help communities like ours to talk about issues related to housing, related to climate solutions. When we start to talk about, carbon sequestration and carbon pricing, or how do we address these, or, affordable housing and some of the statutes, how do we help neighbors listen to one another? And I think the facilitation is something that's really wonderful that you can bring to communities all over Connecticut.
All right. So as we finish up, just like to invite each of you to say a few words about what it's been like to be. I asked you why you accepted the invitation. Now we're finished. What's it been like for you to participate with this audience out there? Some of whom got on the screen with us, and others whom have been listening. So what's this been like for you, Representative Harding?
Again, this is a great experience, and I think what I was looking forward to is what this has been. I think it's opened my eyes, and this has been as helpful to me as I hope it's been to everyone else in the audience, is to kind of fleshing out these issues. It's allowed me to provide or look at this in a different perspective, and it's provided ideas to ways we can break the polarization and work better together in a bipartisan fashion. So this has been very helpful to me. It's been just talking this through and hearing from Rep. McCarthy Vahey and hearing from others in the audience. It's helped me, give me a different perspective heading into hopefully a legislative session that I'll be a part of. And So I want to thank everyone for putting this together tonight, and thank everyone for allowing me to participate in the way that I did. It was very helpful to me and quite enjoyable too. So thank you.
So Representative McCarthy.
Thank you, Bill. And I would concur with Rep. Harding. I really just appreciated the opportunity to think more and focus more on these issues, to engage in the conversation with Rep. Harding. And certainly there are lots of perspectives that we share and many that we don't. I think this has been validating for me about the importance of doing this work. And I will be honest also, we're in campaign season. So as I share some of these things about myself and my perspective, there's part of me in the back of my mind wondering, oh, I can't wait to hear this as a soundbite or something later in the campaign. And that may happen. But frankly, if we're not willing to be open and vulnerable with one another, we're not going to move forward. And so I think, you know, again, I talk about the comfortable and the discomfort. That's been part of my experience in sharing some of the things that I have tonight, but I also am deeply committed to continuing to do this work. We will not survive together on this planet. And I know it may sound like an exaggeration, but we will not survive together on this planet unless we learn how to survive together and work together. So I feel grateful, as you said, Rep. Harding, for the privilege of participating in this, and also grateful for the people who took the time to listen to us and to invest in this, and who also think that this work is important, and certainly all of you, the Braver Angels.
Wonderful. I'd like to say, as the moderator here, that this has been very rich, going from family stories, you know, parents, grandparents, family, to very specific pieces of work that need to be done now, that have urgency, that you think if you all could come together on. So it was very, very rich, and I hope we can do this with other legislators too, because you folks are living this every day, and you're able to talk about the positives that happen as well as the challenges. And there are not many folks in your shoes. It's easy to talk about polarization in general and how to fix it, and you're living in the middle of it. And the insights you shared with us, I think, are very valuable and unique. Okay, so now we're going to hand it over to Al Smith, who is your constituent, Representative Harding. All right. Sorry, Representative McCarthy, we didn't get one of yours on here too, but Al is the guy.
Yeah, I am, along with Chris Fluette, the co-chair of the Connecticut Braver Angels Alliance. First, a word of thanks to Representatives McCarthy, Vahey, and Harding for taking the time away from their busy schedules during an election year and enlightening us all about the political climate at the Connecticut State House. To our moderator, Bill Doherty, for guiding us through this very interesting and informative discussion. And to our co-sponsors, Connecticut Public and the Governor Jody Rell Center for Public Service, for getting the word out and promoting this event. And you may have seen a quick shout out to Governor Rell. She was on the session. I think she's on the session. Thank you for joining us. Let me just close by saying this. If you like what you heard tonight, if you are one of many Americans, majority of Americans, frustrated with the division in our country, if you believe we have to get back to civil discourse between citizens and elected officials, and if you feel we need to stop stereotyping and labeling individuals simply because they have a different voice or on a matter or a different opinion, then you may want to consider joining the Braver Angels growing movement. And we are growing across the country. Here's how you can join us. On the screen, you'll see a website. This is our Connecticut Alliance website. I suggest you go there. You'll see information about our local and our national events. And there is something, a Getting Involved tab. When you go to that, it'll show you a variety of ways how you can get involved with us. It does not take a lot of time. Devote what you can but we think we're on a very important mission and we'd like to have you join us. And the email address, if you want any questions answered or want to get me in touch with us, that's the email address and we will get back to you. And finally, I recommend an opportunity to find out what it entails to be a Connecticut Braver Angels citizen volunteer. To do that, register for our orientation session. Only runs about 40 minutes long. We're going to have one next Wednesday, the 14th at 7 p.m. The link is posted on our website. And now I think it's even in the chat. So please join us. No commitments. Find out more how you can help. We'd love to have you join us. And with that, thank you very much for attending.